Good morning. Welcome to the new year. This is our first show of the new year. I'm Senator Dick Black, retired senator, and normally we would have been joined by John Tigas. John is in court right now, and he is defending a case where it's sort of an example of government corruption, where we have a man who a very dedicated guy, a fellow with a flawless record, and he was invited to attend a school board meeting based on a public notice that went out. And John Tigas went to speak. He's a leader of prominence in our community. And while he was there, I gave a speech that blew things apart, and the crowd started getting up on their chairs and applauding and cheering. And the school board made a motion, and they very quickly adjourned and ran out of the room, at which point the superintendent of schools issued an unlawful order declaring the citizens of Loudoun County to constitute an unlawful assembly. And based on that, there were sheriff's deputies who were ordered to go in and to begin taking down people who were present at the meeting. And John, all that he did is he stood up on a chair with some group of people around him and spoke about the events that he had intended to speak about in the first place. And so based on his attendance at a place he was invited to be by a public announcement of a governmental agency to come there to speak, which is what he did, but he refused to obey a clearly unlawful order that had no basis in law. And because he wouldn't follow this unlawful order that had no basis in law, he has been prosecuted under the aegis of one of the Soros prosecutors, and he continues to be in court. That's why he's not here today. So anyway, what we're going to do today is I am going to talk with you a little bit first about the election of the Speaker of the House. And then secondly, I want to look back at some dramatic changes in 2022. And my take on it will be a little bit different than what you would hear in the mainstream media, the corporate media, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. So let me start with the Speaker of the House, though. Kevin McCarthy was the heir apparent. He was going to be sworn in as the Speaker of the House. He was going to be elected yesterday, and didn't happen. He went up for election fairly early in the afternoon. When the elections were counted, he fell significantly short of what he needed to win the election. They went to a second ballot. Once again, his name was put up. This time he was actually endorsed by the fellow who most people think is sort of the second most likely person to become the Speaker of the House, and that's Jim Jordan. Jim Jordan spoke quite eloquently in favor of McCarthy for the position. But after that, the vote in favor of Kevin McCarthy was even weaker. Then there was finally a third vote held later in the afternoon, and the results did not go well for McCarthy. Each time he lost strength. In each of the three votes, he started off considerably behind where he needed to be to win. Each vote, he became less strong. At this point, it seems to me that his chances of election are rather remote. He has tremendous support from the establishment. The corporate media all want him to be the Republican Speaker of the House. That doesn't matter whether you're talking about CNN or Fox News or Wall Street Journal or New York Times. They all want Kevin McCarthy to be the leader. And but it seems unlikely at this point that that will happen. Now, this is quite a historic moment. This is the first time that it has taken multiple votes to elect a speaker since 1923. So it's been 100 years since the last time that we had an impasse of this sort. And we will see. We're sort of in somewhat uncharted waters. But I think for one thing, this is, regardless of what the outcome ultimately is, I think it has been a major victory for conservatives. The typical way these things are done is that you'll have someone who functions in a very liberal manner over a number of years, and then he comes out and he says, well, look here, I'm going to do this, 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 and this for you, and now I'm good to go, and I want your support. And typically, the conservatives just give in. They say, well, you know, he's given us something. You know, we're so accustomed to getting nothing over decades and decades. Let's accept, you know, a drop in the bucket, and we'll be happy. But we've got some very tough people. One of those tough people is Virginia Congressman Bob Good, quite a fine leader, and he's one of the key players in the battle to elect someone other than McCarthy as a speaker. Here's the thing with, you know, you'll hear so many of these mainstream commentators, and they'll say, well, you know, what more do these conservatives want? He's already promised 2 or 3 things. Why don't they tell us what's the other thing that you want? Maybe 2 things. However, there's an old saying in politics that people are policy. People are policy. And what does this mean? When I was in the Senate, people knew I was conservative. So when they voted for me, they didn't just vote for me because I said I promised to do A, B, C, D, E. Because the fact of the matter is that I'm making thousands of decisions. I'm making hundreds of decisions every single day that the legislature is in session. I'm making dozens of decisions every single day when we're not in session, but I'm out engaged with the community and so forth. And almost none of these decisions that I make will be reported on. But that doesn't mean that they're not very, very important. Doesn't mean that they don't set the direction of Virginia politics. So what if I had not been so deeply ideologically conservative? Because I was the most conservative member of both the House and the Senate over this 20-year span. What if instead I had been a liberal for all these years, and then I said, look, I promise to do, I'm going to vote pro-life, I'm going to vote pro-marriage, I'm going to vote pro-gun, and now I want you to vote for me. Get off your high horse, all you Christian conservatives, and face the fact that I deserve the vote, and you should be voting for me. And what if all of the Virginia media had chimed in and said, yeah, everybody's crazy for not voting against this, not voting for this guy. Yeah, sure, he's been liberal all of these decades and decades, but look, he's promised to do a few conservative things. Now get off your high horse and just back him. I mean, that's really what's happening with Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy, whoever is the speaker, let's not say Kevin McCarthy, whoever is the speaker will make tens of thousands of decisions. They will appoint a staff, a major staff, and that staff, each one of them will make tens of thousands of decisions. You won't even know who they are. You will never see their faces, but the speaker will know who they are. So when we say people are policy, policy is not about a list of 5 items. Policy is about tens of thousands of things happening, the wheels in the machine that are going around. And if the wheels of that machine are conservative wheels, many, many, many conservative things happen. If you have a situation like you had with John McCain, John was a total fraud. He had absolute contempt for the voters. But come election time, he would go out and he would say, I'm going to do ABC. Now, I never did it, but he always promised. And then the media would say, well, what's with all these conservatives? You know, he promised he'd do those 3 things. You know, what the nerve of them to say that the great John McCain shouldn't be reelected. Well, John McCain, this man was so committed against the American people that literally, almost on his deathbed, he went and he cast the deciding vote to preserve Obamacare against the vast will of the American people.
Senator, you muted yourself. You may want to unmute. Senator, you're still muted.
Okay, am I back with you?
There we go. Yep, you're back.
Okay, well, our apologies for the brief intermission.
The last thing you heard was that he voted to preserve Obamacare.
Yes. So John McCain voted to preserve Obamacare as his final gift to the American people, to say, look, I have so much contempt for all of you people who have voted for me over these years. I'm just going to spit in your eye from my deathbed. And So that was a guy that we were over and over convinced to vote for. And I think these conservative Republicans are saying, sorry, we're not going to have somebody around to spit in our eye a couple of years from now. And keep in mind that Kevin McCarthy raised lots and lots of money and spent lots and lots of money to make sure that many of these incoming members never won the nomination for Congress. Ones that ultimately went on and won their seats. So anyway, we'll see what happens. Let me shift gears now. We've had some dramatic changes that occurred in the past year in 2022. So we're looking back now, but I think it's worthwhile to do it because it tells us something about the direction that we are headed. The first one that comes to mind, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just some incredibly dramatic changes. The U.S. Supreme Court has taken a dramatically different course than what it had been on. Back around 1952, when I was a very little boy, we would drive from Miami, Florida, up north to Maryland, Reisterstown, Maryland, and we would pass by signs that would say "Impeach Earl Warren." Earl Warren was he was Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court at the time, and he had redirected America on a course where the courts acted as a force to impose a dictatorial regime that sort of crushed out the people's freedom and their constitutional rights. And that went on just almost throughout my entire lifetime. And it was for a change of this sort, for the U.S. Supreme Court to begin to reorient towards defending the Bill of Rights instead of crushing it out and diminishing it. This is a monumental change for them to begin to rein in the unlawful excesses of the other branches of the federal government. This is a monumental thing. So let's take a look at some of the cases that have outlined this new policy that's taking effect. The first one was the case of Dobbs versus Jackson, which overruled Roe versus Wade and said that no, the U.S. Constitution doesn't confer a right to abortion. And it says that the states have the right to regulate abortion, to the extent that abortion is not somehow impacted by federal law. Now, this is interesting because the Supreme Court said that first of all, abortion is not mentioned in the Constitution as a constitutional right. But the second thing is that they said that you cannot have a right to abortion that is not deeply rooted in the country's history at the time of the enactment of the constitutional provisions that are at issue. And of course, when the United States was founded, and almost until Roe versus Wade was unilaterally imposed on us by the dictates of the Supreme Court, abortion was reviled by every state. It was prohibited by every state. And because of that, it required the force of the U.S. Supreme Court basically to overcome all of the laws of all of the states and create this new right to abortion, which essentially was the right to engage in child sacrifice. And we've done that on a monumental scale that has changed the demographics of the United States and done incalculable damage to the United States. But I think the fact that now we have the Supreme Court looking back and saying, okay, constitutional rights are what they were at the time that they were enacted. They don't simply emerge from the ionosphere. They are things that are explicitly outlined in the Constitution, or things that reasonably flow from them and from the way that the world was at the time. So this was an incredibly important case. We had another one, though, not nearly so well known, but it was West Virginia versus EPA. And in this case, the Supreme Court dealt a very major blow to the EPA's power to regulate carbon emissions. And we have this mythology that exists as sort of a superstitious cloud, this idea that somehow carbon dioxide changes the climate. No proof for it, but there's a lot of superstitious nonsense and a lot of government-funded studies that come to that conclusion. But in any event, the question in West Virginia versus EPA is whether the Environmental Protection Agency could exercise the power to regulate carbon dioxide on the theory that it creates climate change. And the decision by the conservative court majority, the decision was 6-3, so it's a very strong majority. And they said that any time that an agency does something big and new, in this case addressing climate change, that the regulation is presumptively invalid unless Congress has specifically authorized regulating within this particular sphere. So in other words, they've set up a rule that says that delegation of monumental congressional power is disfavored, and that if you're going to do it, it's got to be done very explicitly. And this is something called the Major Questions Doctrine. It's championed by Chief Justice John Roberts, who believes very deeply in it. And the Major Questions Doctrine says that neither the EPA nor any other agency may adopt rules that are transformational to the economy unless Congress has specifically authorized such a transformative rule. It's been said that the decision is a particularly bad omen for environmentalists, and that it seems to reject any all-encompassing regulatory attempt to deal with climate change. But I think it speaks very well to the idea of reining in agency power under these very vague delegations of authority by Congress. Okay, now here's another one. And this goes to individual rights. This is 303 Creative versus Elenis. Here we had a Colorado web designer who refused to design a wedding for homosexuals, and she refused to do it on free speech grounds. And she said that being forced to create web pages to promote homosexual weddings violates her First Amendment right to free speech. And the court seems to have no problem at all with reinvigorating the idea of free speech as being foundational to the First Amendment. However, there's still unwillingness to reinvigorate and unleash the free exercise of religion, which is the very first provision of the First Amendment. And part of what's going on is you have this lingering struggle between Christianity and homosexuality. Christianity and homosexuality are a zero-sum game. When one wins, the other loses, and vice versa. And so I think there's an unease within the federal courts that they're not quite willing to give religion predominance over sodomy. And I don't think any one of them would consciously express it that way, but in effect, that's what's going on, is you still have this struggle. I suspect there will come a time in years not too far off that we will start to see religious freedom reinvigorated. I think we're going to see all parts of the Bill of Rights raised up and returned to their former status. Now, here's another case. Students for Fair Admissions versus President and Fellows of Harvard College. And there's a related case, Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina. These are a fairly frontal assault on the tradition of using racial discrimination against white and Asian students in favor of blacks and other minorities. And this group, Students for Fair Admissions, it's an activist legal group that is designed to oppose racist standards for college admissions. And so what they do is they say, look, universities have no business weighing the value of this race or that race in college admissions. If somebody applies for college, they should be evaluated based on their intellectual merits, and the schools have no right to even know what the race of an individual is when they make their decisions. There are strong indications that the U.S. Supreme Court is inclined to support a racially neutral approach on college campuses, really since the first time since I was a child. There is a case that was passed in 2003 called Gruttinger versus Bollinger, and that decision of the U.S. Supreme Court allowed racial discrimination as long as the university asserted that there were other things that were thrown into the mix, that you look at somebody's background and, you know, whether they played badminton or whether they did this or that. And so you were allowed to discriminate predominantly against the whites, but also Asians were becoming more important. And I think there are strong indications that this whole race-based system is starting to come unglued, which, is one of those things that's most necessary to begin to return us to a nation where all men are considered equal before the law. And no one is equal. I'm not equal to anybody in the audience here. You're not equal to me. We each have our strengths and weaknesses. One of the most patently absurd things is the idea that, it's just comment that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, they're not. I mean, it's self-evident that they are not created equal. Identical twins are not created equal. And every parent of identical twins knows that this twin, even though they look almost exactly alike, this twin is a little bit more motivated. This one is a little more artistic. There are major differences even among identical twins. So no two people are equal, and the idea that you could somehow make them to be such is quite absurd. Okay, now let me shift from the courts. Okay, so I've talked about the courts. The courts are on an enormously important trend of restoring the Bill of Rights, restoring freedom, restoring the balance of powers, and reining in the bureaucracy. Very positive thing. I mean, when you talk about hope, when have you ever been able to say, my hope is that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to do something good? But I think perhaps for my lifetime, it won't be unusual to look out and say, I'm hoping that the Supreme Court does something good this year. But I'm very hopeful. Now, let me go on to the second thing. You won't hear this discussed anywhere else because everybody is so delicate about it. But there has been a nationwide shift against pedophilia and sexual grooming in the schools. And what is happening for the past several decades, this literally a global movement of homosexuality and sodomy has used the media to craft a narrative of what a homosexual is. If you watch television, you're told that a homosexual is someone who has the most charming sense of humor, and they're just sweetie pie people. Everybody loves them, and they couldn't possibly cause a problem for anybody. They're just such sweetie pies. And of course, it's what has happened is that over these decades, the traditional cultural association between homosexuality and pedophilia was erased, and people began to forget what people knew back in biblical times and before biblical times, and that is that homosexuality is very deeply intertwined with pedophilia. Well, what has happened is that the outrageous behavior of homosexuals in the public school system, the transgender story hour, where you have bizarre, frightening, hideous men dressed up in women's sexual outfits. They're being asked to go into into schools and to teach little children, sort of get them used to this acceptance of the idea that you could have a man who pretends he's a woman who really likes to talk about sex with little children. Well, people now are beginning to say, wait a minute, okay, this is pedophilia, right? Right, got it. Pedophilia is where you have men who are out there titillating themselves by engaging in promiscuous things with boys. Not always just promiscuous. Can't tell you how many men, if you really get into it, will reveal to you that they were raped as children. And so I think what has happened is there has been a breakdown of this illusion created by the left that homosexuality could be separated from pedophilia. And people are beginning to realize, okay, homosexuality is in very large measure about pedophilia. It is about sodomy. It is about child rape. And so this is a very important and fundamental shift that has happened just in the past year. And I don't think the left will be able to easily put it back in the box. People are becoming more outspoken, more forthright about acknowledging the problem with the transgenders. And it's not just the transgender, of course, because they're homosexuals. They just, their gig is to put on lipstick and a dress, but they're still homosexuals who want to engage in sex with little boys. Okay, so that is a very, very big thing. The breakdown of the illusion over homosexuality and pedophilia. Now, the next thing, you run into these things where you say, who would have predicted this? Social media censorship was on an incredible roll. You had the federal government engaged in imposing its will, controlling what people could say, what they couldn't. And all of a sudden, you had this enormous setback when Elon Musk, the world's richest man, a lifelong Democrat, just got a thing about it and decided that he believed in free speech. And he took over Twitter, and now he's disclosed all of these things we knew were going on, but you always have to have proof beyond reasonable doubt before a conservative is considered something other than a tinfoil hat, whatever. They have all of these things they use to smear people. But now Elon Musk has become a global Superman on free speech. It's tying liberals in knots. Who knows where it's going to end up? Okay, just to touch on a couple of things. In China, you had this bizarre zero COVID policy. One of the greatest mistakes made by the Chinese in recent decades. It seemed like the Chinese could do nothing wrong for the longest time. Then all of a sudden, they just shot themselves in the foot with this totally absurd zero COVID policy. And the Chinese people, finally had enough of it. They started rioting in the streets. The Communist Party, I think, had a meeting in the woodshed with Xi Jinping and said, I'm going to tell you something, either this thing ends right now dramatically, or you end dramatically. And the bizarre zero COVID policy vanished overnight. It is not being enforced. It's not being talked about. It's nothing. And they've said, okay, if we have a lot of COVID, if we have a COVID outbreak, tough luck, we'll live through it. This is China. We got lots of people. And so they're on a very good course now. And they're still going to suffer gravely because of the economic decisions, but they've gotten on a very good course. And that was an overnight type of thing. I'm going to, there are others that I could go into, but for now I'm going to stop it at this, and then we will meet again on Monday at 11. But thank you for joining me, and we look forward to a coming new year where there are going to be tremendous opportunities. Anybody who thinks there's no hope you're just not looking in the right places. So I look forward to many very fascinating things this coming year. Hopefully we can keep the liberal Republicans and the Marxist Democrats from triggering World War III and killing us all. If we can do that, I think maybe somehow we can muddle through. This has been Senator Dick Black, retired, with Focus on the News. See you next Monday.